Here we go.
Okay, yes, thank you very much again for the invitation to present this research project here at the Global China Lunch. So this project, as was already mentioned by Sigrun, is called A Middle Way, Probing Sufficiency Through Meat and Milk in China. So now I will just spend a little bit of time presenting some of the work that we are doing and some of the ideas behind this project. And I look very much forward to hear your feedback and questions and comments about this, because the approach in itself is not necessarily fixed, and there are many things that can be adjusted. So we look very much forward to your input. But first, I'll start by just presenting myself a little bit. Currently, I am an associate professor here at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture at NTNU. I have a background within, or a PhD within STS, Science and Technology Studies, or Science, Technology and Society, which also is STS acronym. And my focus was on Chinese renewable struggles, focusing on innovation and what I call the arts of the state in China. So it's a kind of a pun based on state of the art, but here in the Chinese context, it's focusing on how the Chinese government was working in many ways to promote the development of an industry, namely the offshore wind industry. And my master's was in cultural studies, so culture, environment, and sustainability from the University of Oslo. And my master, I was focusing quite a lot on wind energy in China. And since that time, since that focus on renewable energy, I have been focusing quite a lot on sustainability work in a Norwegian context. And a couple of years ago, I started focusing on food and agriculture. And now I've finally been able to also apply that perspective on China. It took several years of applying to get these research projects. I think I tried 4 times in total, and in the end, I was able to get funding for this project. So I'm very, very happy about that. And the topic is, of course, on agri-food systems in China and the topic of sufficiency. I just want to mention my background is not within China studies or sinology, so I don't know necessarily ancient historical concepts or things that have to do with Chinese language very much in detail. So I would say I have a more of a superficial understanding of Chinese language. Just so you know that in case I get any questions about that later. Now this ERC starting grant, so it's from the European Research Council, and the project is 1.5 million euros, lasts for 5 years. We have hired 2 PhDs, and we are currently in the process of hiring a postdoc. And we also have 3 researchers and 1 admin. And of course, myself, I spend 50% of my time on this project. So here's the team that is involved. As you can see, the 2 PhD candidates here, Wenjia and Tarye, they are currently, or Wenjia is currently on fieldwork in China doing research on milk. And Tarye, he will travel to China in June or July. And he has a China studies background, and he will do research on salmon and salmon infrastructures in China. And we have Shu Hua, who's an anthropologist, a background in anthropology, and has done a lot of work on China and focusing on meat consumption. And she's currently doing work on pork consumption in China. And Dongming and Wang Yu are colleagues from NTNU here I've been working with for several years, and they are currently responsible for the historical part, looking into Chinese historical references and looking into the Chinese literature, while I myself have more a responsibility for the English language literature and in terms of Chinese history. And Chang Yu she's our higher executive officer. So just to get this framing for you, why is this topic important? And this is just very, very briefly. I think there are 2 challenges that need to be addressed simultaneously, and China is sort of in the middle of all of this. So the first is the problem of malnutrition and obesity. And there's a lot of research showing, and also reports from China showing that obesity is an increasing concern, also amongst the younger generation in China. And that is also a problem globally. But also, on the other hand, the food systems that we have today, the agri-food systems, including both the production and the consumption, they are out of balance. They are facing large challenges because of the environmental challenges that they cause. So this is connected to this thing about the planetary boundaries that are exceeded, and also we need to consider health boundaries. And a middle way is basically somewhere where we were able to cater for both health, individual health, and planetary health as well. So this is just some numbers showing the impact of food production and consumption. So 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, up to 80% of biodiversity loss, and 70% of freshwater use. So these are large issues. So the Midway project, very, very briefly, here's the overview of the project in itself. The idea is to study the concept of sufficiency as an organizing principle to achieve reduced consumption based on the examples of meat and milk in China. So the idea behind it is not, and I want to make this clear in the beginning, the idea is not, we don't want to say that we want to achieve reduced consumption in China, but we are using the cases of meat consumption and production and milk consumption and production in China to understand how the demand for these products have increased in order to get an understanding of demand itself and how that can be changed and reduced. So these are very good cases to study, which I'll come back to in a bit, because the change has happened so quickly the past years. That's why China is a very, very good case to follow. So we have three aspects to this. One is the historical part, where we try to understand how meat and milk have been constructed as essential foods. How have these become so widely consumed as they have become today? Then we try to understand from a contemporary perspective how meat and milk is continually reproduced as essentially essential foods. So what places do meat and milk have in contemporary urban food practices? So we focus more on the urban areas, and also the changes of what we call systems of provision. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit. That's basically connecting the production side to the consumption side. And then all of this is supposed to lead to conceptual work where we try to understand the concept of sufficiency itself. And we also try to come with some policy recommendations in this process, but that is something that we'll try to come with a bit later on. So there's one thing I want to mention, I'll come back to it later, is that we also have these what we call multi-stakeholder workshops that are also co-designing our research approach, and also trying to facilitate mutual learning, because we don't want to be a Western project coming in and saying how China is supposed to do it. We want to use this as an opportunity to learn and understand what are the local concerns. So just briefly, why meat and milk in China? The first sort of premise here, and this is not only for China, this is globally, consuming animals is not a necessary or given, it's not inevitable. So we need to understand, how have they become so central? How is this a part of an actively constructive process? So we have this constructivist lens in this project, which we don't take it for granted that animals should be consumed. They have become consumed over a long process from production to consumption that has to do with how they have been invoked as sort of rendered consumable. And that's the premise, but this also goes for Norway, for example. I mean, it's kind of not given that we should drink, for example, the milk of a cow. But it has become completely normalized today, right? So, but in a Chinese context, in a historical context, milk was considered distasteful. It was not an integral part of the diet of common people in China. was considered somewhat barbarian. On the other hand, meat was high status, but it was also consumed very sparingly amongst common people, but the status was higher. So that makes this an interesting comparison, because one of these had very low status, but today is relatively widely consumed, and the other had high status and is also widely consumed. And the last thing I want to mention is that this is interesting in a Chinese context because of the rapid growth in production and consumption that's happened the past 40 years. This is a graph just showing them the production side of pork and of milk. And these numbers are a little bit outdated, and I should, of course, update them. But it's just to give you a glimpse. You see that milk increased very quickly in the 2000s and seemed to have reached sort of a plateau in the 2006 to 8, around that. But pork has been increasing steadily over time. And there was a big dip because of the African swine fever, which was around 2018-19, and still partly ongoing in China. Okay, now we'll delve into this concept, the sufficiency concept. I'm sure many of you are probably wondering a little bit, what does it mean? What is it? At the very basic basis, it's about thinking about limits. So there is something which is too much. It's an upper boundary. And it's both biophysical in terms of the planetary, but also physiological in terms of our own body. And it's obvious to us that it's possible to consume too much of something. And on the other hand, it's also too little. The lower boundaries basically connected to our human needs and human well-being. So the sort of working definition that we have been using is that possibility of having enough of something for a certain purpose. And this point about the purpose here brings into view this constructivist lens that we have, that it depends really on what you want to achieve. You know, when you invite someone over to a dinner, you might want to have a little bit more food than necessary, because that's a social context where you want to have that. So it doesn't make sense to talk about enough, in a universal way. It needs to be, you have to consider the context in question, the culture in question, and so on. So this is why I would say maybe the key question that we try to understand is this last one here: how is enough constructed? How is it normalized? What is a good life understood and normalized? And this is just sort of a quote from Emperor Qianlong. They go back, he wrote a letter to King George III, when he answered King George that our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. So the idea was, of course, that they had enough of everything. They didn't need anything more. And this is something that's changed, because now the idea of global trade has changed quite a lot of this understanding. But to go a little bit more into sort of depth on this, in a Chinese context, there are several references to balance, moderation, frugality. And this is a quote from Lao Tzu, saying, "He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." And the idea here is not to say that China is necessarily, let's say, more promising in terms of sufficiency because of this historical legacy, because we also can find references to such ideas in Europe and in other Western contexts. So it's not necessarily the case that China is more promising in this respect, but we do know that these principles have been important in the past, and it also means that they have changed. So we would like to try to understand how these things have changed in a social context. So in the Midway project, we see sufficiency as an organizing principle that opens up for studying how conventions and needs change. So that's why analytically, to us, sufficiency basically critically explores the construction of needs, opening for an analysis that problematizes what's enough and too much, while recognizing that today's consumption levels are not inevitable or necessary. They could be different, basically. So that's the core sort of conceptual understanding of this project, and I'll go a little bit more into detail about how we are intending to approach this. So these are the research questions that we defined in the project, and they are similar to the ones that I just mentioned some slides ago. But noting here, and then this contemporary aspect is basically research question 2 and 3. What places do meat and milk have in contemporary urban food practices? How and why has this changed along changes in materials, meanings, and competences? So this refers to this practice perspective that we have. I will get back to that. What is this kind of practice perspective? And also the systems of provision, where we try to connect the food chains with the current consumption. And then this will lead to this kind of conceptual research question that tries to understand sufficiency concepts in a Chinese context. And it should be mentioned that it is also possible that sufficiency doesn't make sense. I mean, this sufficiency concept doesn't make sense in a Chinese context. So we also have to open up for that in this project. It's not something that we try to force down on this case. Just to give you an idea about where we are in the project, we are currently in a little bit more than halfway. So halfway, not halfway, I mean halfway in year 2. And we still have quite some work in front of us. We've mainly focused on the historical parts now, and we have hired a few PhD candidates that are looking into these chain perspectives. And we have a postdoc that we want to help us to look into this comparative aspect, where you compare meat and milk and also compare internationally. And here are some of the methods that we use. So archival research and analysis of written sources, home visits, interviews, and food diaries. This is something that I myself will do. So in September, I'm going to China for around 3 months, where I plan to visit around 15 to 20 families in a selection of tier 2 and 3 cities. So tier 2 and 3, that means not the largest, hugest cities, but a little bit smaller cities. Because on the one hand, we think that the larger cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Tianjin, they are somewhat overstudied. We know quite a lot about them, but we don't know so much about the somewhat smaller cities. But it still is an urban context. And we will do this multi-sited ethnography that's been mentioned. That's the work of the PhD candidates. And then we have these multi-stakeholder workshops. And just to explain to you a little bit more what these multi-stakeholder workshops are, the whole idea behind it is that we'll have scholars, policymakers, and industry stakeholders, and also organizations to meet in these workshops to discuss this approach that we're thinking about. Their understanding of food systems and sustainability, well-being, and reflecting also on these ideas of reduction and what is too much and so on. So we had a workshop already in August in Guangzhou last year, and I will come back a little bit to that, to what we sort of found there. But if you want to learn the details about what we learned there, I would recommend to look into our blog. We have a blog on our website, so I'll come back to that website in a few minutes. But the idea is that the workshop is sort of participatory and a grounded way to address the research. And the first workshop was more to allow to feed into our research design, while the second is to try to co-produce these policy suggestions that we want to try to come up with. But we also want to avoid what I just mentioned earlier, that we come in and say, these are the important things you should focus on. We want this to be co-produced by local stakeholders. That's one of our main efforts in this project. Some of the planned outputs that we will have, we are of course planning to write a book, which will come more towards the end of the project. 2 PhD theses, several articles that will be co-authored, and this toolbox for industry and policymakers. And we don't know exactly how that will look yet. So if you have any good ideas, of course, they're very welcome. Now I just want to go into our theoretical approach. This approach might be familiar to some of you, but it might also be new to some of you. So I'll go quickly through this idea of practices. The practice theory is what we use. We're very much inspired by the work of Elizabeth Shove, who is also in the advisory board of this project. And the idea is that the practices here basically is an attempt to try to understand how animals have become embedded into food practices over time in a variety of ways, but in particularly through influences of these three, what we call elements here. So different material surroundings. That could be things such as using phones to order takeaway food, but it could also be the elements connected to the production side. I mean, the practices connected to food production, but also the meanings surrounding, for example, what is healthy, what is considered to be a good life, status is an important part of it. How has milk become sort of a high status status product? And the competences. How is the food prepared? How is it consumed? How is it shopped? What about the role of supermarkets, the role of refrigerators, how we conserve food, and how this has changed over time slowly through these elements. And that's what we want to try to investigate. And that's one of the reasons when I do these home visits later this year, we want to, for example, take pictures of refrigerators and freezers to see if they have an increasing role in consuming animal-based foods. And then there's this systems of provision approach, which tries to look more. So if you think about practices more as a horizontal, then the food chains and the systems of provision is more of this vertical approach, and try to look at the inclusive chain of activity that connects consumption to the production. And there's no ideal here. I mean, these are processes that are sort of socially and historically contingent. So we need to understand them from their context, from their local point of view. And it's in the end, it's about sort of understanding between the relation between urban centers and rural farms, and production, how the production centers have also increasingly become alienated from consumption areas. The fact that we are more and more remote, we are more further removed from the food that we consume. This also masks much of the what goes into the production of these animal-based foods. So basically, the present-day food waste understood through food chains. So just to summarize this approach, so it's both historical and contemporary. So understanding how things change over time, and also understanding how these same elements are reproduced in continuous relational accomplishments today in a Chinese urban context. And then, of course, it's connecting production and consumption. So these are the two, let's say, two key conceptual novelties that we do in this project, which we hope will allow us to gain a better understanding of how demand changes over time, and how that could then also help us to understand the concept of sufficiency, how what is enough is constructed, and how it can then potentially be including also reduced consumption. So the implications of this is that understanding the co-constitution and supply and demand of animal products in food in a holistic way, to understand the embeddedness of animals in food, not taking it as a given or an inevitable, but thinking that this could have been different. The different quantities could have been different animals consumed, different practices, different ways of consuming, and also how they're prepared and eaten. And this, of course, we know this because historically it's been different, but also if you look at different countries, so in this kind of country comparison, a comparative perspective is very useful to understand how these things could be different. And that is also something that we will work with in this postdoc position that will be hired. So here's a little bit more from our workshop. We had this workshop on urban food sufficiency and sustainable agriculture in China. We had partners from different aspects of industry and academia coming there to participate. And if you, like I said earlier, if you want to know more about that, you can check our blog. But the ongoing and also next steps, just to summarize this, is so we'll hire this postdoc and we'll start in September. The field work, and also I forgot to mention this point about salmon. That topic was added in because one of the PhD candidates wanted to focus on salmon, and I think it is still a very interesting perspective to understand how demand for salmon has come up as an increasing sort of, it is considered still a luxury food, but it is also becoming more normalized. And that is also sort of very interesting to understand for us, connected to how demand for these animal-based foods are produced. So that's also why we thought this could be very fitting. And as mentioned already, home visits, interviews, and food diaries will be done September to November. And then we will have a big conference, which marks the halfway of our project, which will be in June in 2025. It will most likely be in Oslo next year, but we will send out information as soon as the dates have been set. Yes, and as I mentioned, we have a blog on this website that I recommend you to check out and follow up. And to sum up, the points that we have in this project is basically moving beyond efficiency thinking. Efficiency thinking is the current organizing principle that much of society is organized according to, and we try to move beyond that to think, if we really want to take reduction seriously, how can we approach it? And that's why we try to understand sufficiency. And the conceptual novelty here is also connected to the understanding of the co-constitution of supply and demand. And of course, the empirical urgency to understand this in an urban Chinese context, the potential for sustainability change. Yes, so that's actually all that I had prepared for this presentation. And I very much look forward to hearing your comments and questions, anything that you might be wondering about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marius. It was super interesting. I stopped the recording.